Well, good evening and welcome to everyone to this live stream discussion this evening on the ACMA's proposals on class licensing for the amateur radio service in Australia. We're going to dive straight into it, and I'm going to hand over to Scott, VK3KJ, the WIA president, who will make some opening comments. Good evening, Scott, and to everyone.
Yeah, hi, Hayden. And firstly, let me just start off by saying thank you, Hayden, to you for hosting this on behalf of the WIA. Look, greetings to everybody. We've got a lot of people online. We're going to try and punch through it fairly quickly this evening. I know we all don't want to be here all night. But look, just before I get underway, if I can, just a couple of little things. I'd firstly like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet today, wherever you might be across this great nation. And I pay my respect to their elders, past, present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Moving right along, as Hayden introduced, my name's Scott Williams. I'm the president of the WIA. Also, we have tonight on the panel, Lee Moyle, who is the vice president of the WIA. Grant Willis, VK5GR, who will be on the panel tonight, and also Peter Young, VK3MV. I'd like to, if I can, just extend a big thank you to the Spectrum Strategy Group, which have worked tirelessly over the last couple of weeks. I could not tell you the amount of hours that have been put into this consultation and the WIA response and survey. In particular, Grant Willis, VK5GR, thank you, Grant, for all your work. Peter Young, VK3MV, Brian Miller, VK3MI, and we also wish you, Brian, if you are watching, a speedy recovery. Brian just recently had a bit of an accident, a fall, where I think he fell off the roof of his house at Hayden Hospital, so we're all thinking of you, Brian. Justin Giles Clark, VK7TW, Phil Waite, VK2 ASD, Dale Hughes, VK1 DSH, Noel Higgins, VK3NH, and Roger Harrison, VK2ZRH. Thank you so much for all the work you have done. We're about to get underway, but of course tonight is about the WIA's policy development and ultimately what will become our response on behalf of all of our members. And that, of course, is to the ACMA class licensing and higher power consultation. We'll break tonight into two sections. We'll start off discussing the ACMA class licensing, and then the second part of this evening will be about higher power. Look, I'll come back a little bit later, but let's get underway, and I'm going to pass over to Peter, VK3MV. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Scott, and good evening, everyone. I think it's useful to actually try and put some context to what this is all about. And the short potted history. The first radio communications legislation was enacted in 1905. And of course, 1910, amateurs revolting, and the Wireless Institute of Australia started. The legislation then was 6 pages, and all the authority rested in the minister of the day. Roll forward 73 years, and in 1983, the first change of radio communications licensing occurred. Nothing much really changed for the average user or licensee, but one of the key elements was the introduction of standards and for equipment and subsequently electromagnetic radiation. Roll forward another 10 years, in 1992, the Current Act was enacted. It was 268 pages, and I'm not sure what the final count is today because there have been amendments made. But importantly, there was now a subdivision of types of licenses. One was the normal apparatus license, which everybody, well, the majority of radio communications uses, the introduction of a spectrum license, and the new class license. And I think it's useful to talk about what is a class license. And effectively, it's an instrument that is used by a large number of users that have a common use. The typical example is the telecommunications mobile phones. All of your phones which you've got in your pockets or on your desk are in fact covered by a class license. Roll forward and the introduction of a class license replacing the apparatus license for the amateur service. The pros are there are no costs involved in using that license. So your yearly charges are no longer applicable. There's a couple of downsides or potential downsides. That is, all station license details are removed from the radio communications license database. And the only qualification to use the class license, you have to have a recognised amateur qualification. So it's moving from individual licenses to effectively one license type, and entry is via a qualification which is prescribed by the ACMA. So I'll leave it at that, and I think we might just throw it over to Grant to start off a step-by-step through what we've been grappling with for the last 7 weeks, or so 6 weeks.
No problem. Thank you very much, Peter, and good evening, everybody. I guess we wanted to start by just restating the policy that we established last year when the ACMA first announced a review into the structures behind the amateur service. The Institute's policy is and is maintained to still be that we're not looking, we don't support anything that reduces or downgrades from our current principles in apparatus licensing. So whatever the ACMA comes back with the draft class license and the final class license that they want to apply to us, the Institute's not going to accept that unless all of our existing rights and privileges are maintained. So I think it's very important people understand that. I think the other little comment I'll just make about class licensing, in addition to what Peter said, class licenses are used for, I think, a lot more than people realise. It is simply a structure that the ACMA uses for licensing various services, usually unassigned services. And by unassigned, what that means is they don't have a fixed frequency put in a database that is then protected. So amateurs don't have fixed frequencies. You know, I can transmit anywhere I like in the 20-metre band, for example. That means I'm an unassigned service. I have a band of frequencies I'm allowed to use. The ACMA doesn't tell me that I can only go on 14183. There are other services in the same boat, and there are other uses of class licensing that are not dissimilar to what they're proposing for the amateur service here. The most notable one I've seen is, in fact, the maritime ship license. They're also class licensed. They are also qualification based. You have to have your maritime operator certificate to be able to access the maritime class license. So I know there's a lot of concern that the class license may mean an unlicensed service, effectively. People have made that comment. I think it's fair to say the ACMA doesn't view it that way. And certainly from our review of the Act and the way that the class license is architected in the Act, it is an instrument that can fit the amateur service. It's fair to say we still have our concerns, and we'll take you through those today. I think that the simple fact is that despite what we said last time, the ACMA is going to convert the amateur service to class licensing. I think that is just something we have to accept at this point. Some people might say, well, we should fight that to the death. But given it's just a different structure of license, and it's also worth noting, we're not the only country that has gone down this route. The New Zealanders have done the same thing. They've had a class license effectively for the last 10 years. It's not something I think the amateur service needs to be afraid of, especially given some of the feedback that we gave ACMA last time and the things that they have modified since in this latest proposal. So, as I said, New Zealand's had this arrangement for nearly 10 years. The maritime service, the aviation mobile services, they also use similar sorts of arrangements with class licensing. So it's not all the citizens band services, not the low interference potential devices, although they are also using class licensing frameworks. But there are services out there with class licenses where you have to be qualified, you have to have the qualification to be able to access the license. So it's not something to be too concerned about from that perspective. What are some of the things that the ACMA did change since the last time? I mean, I have to say, I think we had a fairly substantial impact on some of their thinking. We didn't obviously get them to back away from class licensing completely, which would have been our ultimate goal. But it is worth noting that they've given us quite a bit of feedback and they've made quite a number of concessions. Have they made enough? We'll see. But some of the highlights to note is they have provided us reassurance that existing interference management arrangements will remain for the amateur service. They made that quite clear in a number of meetings that we've had with them as the WIA with the ACMA over the last 18 months. One really pleasing thing to see is they did actually restore the RF safety management arrangements, the EME management arrangements that we currently have applying to us. They've actually put that now into the class license. So that means that the low-risk transmitters definitions have now been incorporated, which is a big win for us because it means that a lot of things have now much simplified record keeping. We'll talk more about EME later when we particularly get to higher power. They have certainly made an effort to address the CEPT reciprocal arrangements issues that we've raised. We've also been raising some of the issues around other reciprocal licensing arrangements. We're yet to see a total resolution for that, but they have indicated that they are prepared to continue dialogue with us. So hopefully we can make some further inroads there. The other thing they have done is they have proposed much more concrete solutions for call sign management. I think out of all of it, this is probably an area we're a little disappointed in their approach. They certainly don't see call sign management as a regulatory responsibility. They see call signs as something that's more of interest to the amateur service rather than the regulator. We have a little bit more work to do in this space, I think. And you'll see that in some of the concerns that the WIA still has. There are a couple of other wins, though, worth noting about. In particular, they have finally put on the table that they're prepared to grant standard licensees access to the bottom end of 6 metres. This is something that many organisations, and in particular the WIA, has been promoting for many years. Certainly it went into the ACMA's work program consultation from us about 18 months ago. We mentioned it in the last submission as well. They've actually agreed to this particular requirement, which we're very pleased about. Interestingly, and they haven't made much fanfare about this one, but they have, in the draft of the class license, actually dropped the relay restrictions on standard and foundation licensees. So as many amateurs will be aware, we've had problems today where if a foundation licensee comes in on a 2 metre repeater, we have to make sure that they're not relayed to a linked 6 metre repeater. The ACMA has dropped all of those restrictions in the current draft. It's one of the policy questions that we're asking in the survey. We'd like to get some member feedback on that. Is that something that members support? Anecdotally, the bit of feedback we have so far received is that members are welcoming this change. And a little minor winner that we also noted was that they did resolve some of the concerns we had about the LF and MF band technical conditions, particularly the transmitter power limitations that they put in the original draft of the class license. They've obviously demonstrated that they're listening. And when we put up a solid argument, that they're prepared to entertain our concerns. So we're pleased with that development with the ACMA. Ultimately, noting how class licensing has evolved in Australia and how the ACMA today uses it and what sort of frameworks they put around it and what services they're using it with, our ability to object to class licensing point blank sounds a bit hollow. We really are now in a position where, having looked over all of their draft proposals that, provided the remaining outstanding issues are addressed, we should be able to offer qualified support for the ACMA's move to class licensing. But as I said, there are matters that are still outstanding. Peter, you want to talk about this one?
Well, I alluded to the public register, and on the day that the class license comes into effect, all of the information contained in the public register is removed. And that is because the regulator has no lawful and legal reason to maintain that information. So we believe that it is in the public interest, or our interest, and indirectly to the regulator, to have some form of database, and as to who would maintain that database of the issued call signs, the associated qualifications against that call sign, and for a period of time, which is still to be determined, be it 5 years or 10 years, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on.
Yes, most certainly. I guess it's worth also noting our position on this one is ACMA has actually said that they're going to make available a list of call signs through what they're calling the call sign entity. Effectively, that's going to be AMC at this point in time. But they're going to make a list of call signs that are not assigned available. And our view is basically, look, we still need to know what call signs have been issued, what the qualifications are, to know simply that the call sign that we hear on the air has some degree of legitimacy about it. We all have enough problems with pirates as it is, particularly on HF. At least being able to identify is the station real is still an important element that we think of what amateur radio is about. So we take a look at the ACMA has made all these propositions that they're going to have call sign databases available call signs to issue. We turn around and simply say, well, what's wrong with also listing, since you've done that, the call signs that have been issued? We know there's privacy concerns around this. We've heard that loud and clear, and as has the ACMA. It's one of the reasons they want to get rid of the register completely for the amateur service. Our view is, from what we understand of the privacy regulations, that just publishing a list of call signs and qualifications would not violate that, because there's no way you can identify the actual individual from that information. All you know is that the call sign's real, and it's allowed, whoever's operating it is allowed to operate within these conditions. So we don't think this particular ask is onerous on the ACMA. It really would fall to AMC to administer. But we think it's an important step in maintaining some degree of self-regulation with the amateurs. So the next concern we've got is a point of documentation. So the removal, I guess, from the amateur service of the out of the radio communications register is that it makes it much harder for amateurs to have access to relevant documentation to support things like when you want to put your tower up and the local council town planner says, well, yes, you can access that exemption, but only if you're a radio amateur. Prove it. Right now, you pull out your apparatus license, you put it in front of them, they say, okay, thank you. We need that to be maintained. You need to have some sort of documentation that you can access that does that. It's okay for the new applicants from once the class license starts, because ACMA is proposing to do something very similar to New Zealand, where they will incorporate the call sign register or the registered call sign against your certificate of proficiency. But for all of the existing amateurs, they haven't stated how they're going to support that. Similarly, we need that sort of documentation if ever you've tried to travel overseas with amateur equipment and wanted to be able to access amateur licensing through CPT or through reciprocal licensing. You need the documentation to prove that you have a license back home to be able to do it. And another one, we know this is quite a concern for the members who are in this boat. But licensees who do hold a VK apparatus license, but it's based on an overseas certificate of proficiency, i.e. they came into Australia as a migrant and they've been operating under that for many years. We want to make sure that there's documentation available to support this. We also think, in fact, can I get Lee? You want to talk about this one? You're on mute, Lee.
Still on mute.
All right, we're good. How about that? I was actually muted. Who would have thought, Grant? Yeah, so one of the issues is with the license being free, of course, and the call signs basically being free. The ACMA need to set limits on the number of non-assigned call signs held, and if call sign transfer rights are going to be permitted. Otherwise, we may find people just collecting call signs with nice suffixes, etc., and just hoarding effectively. So, and it creates a grey marketplace, which we don't really want. So the proposal that the WIA has put forward is that we get to keep 2 permanent call signs, basically a home call sign and a remote call sign, and the option of 2 temporary call signs, which are yearly renewal, like our 2x1 contest calls, or a special event call sign that we have for a fixed period of time. So that will make it fair on everyone. Yeah, Grant?
Yeah, I was going to say, probably it's also worth just clarifying for people so they do understand the differences. Non-assigned call signs do not include repeaters or beacons. So we're not saying to put any limits on how many call signs you can hold. If you hold 10 repeater licenses, they're over and above all of this.
Yeah.
So
And
they're not the same thing. Repeaters and beacons are in fact being left on our existing apparatus license.
Yep.
So Peter, do you want to take us through the other outstanding issues?
Yes, and the issue about surrounding call signs, of course, is those held by clubs and other groups and organisations. So that we've still got to work through our arrangements there, or it's alerting the ACMA that some of these issues surrounding call signs are not so simple. And of course, the big one is EME management, and it's a highly political area. The authority is extremely aware of public sentiment in this area. So what we've proposed is there are what we classify as low-risk transmitters, and that would fit in with the majority of amateurs. There has always been a requirement, even today, to amateurs to undertake an assessment and of their particular station setup, particularly in respect to where the public boundaries are, and document that. Now, we've looked at all of these scenarios, and clearly some are very hard to quantify, particularly if you're in a portable operation or mobile operation, but nevertheless, and all amateurs are aware persons under the ABANZA Act. That doesn't mean we are exempt from doing anything. We, as aware persons, can stay longer in a particular area where a transmitter is in fact operating. And the issue of management of the use of IRLP, etc., to connect or interconnect transmitters needs to be strengthened to prevent unlicensed access or unauthorised access by non-qualified persons. So the list keeps on rolling along, doesn't it?
Yeah, indeed. There's certainly a few little things that they've been fairly quiet on in their proposal document. This last one, the telecommunications network, what we realised is it's actually been simply removed from the draft class license. We have the clauses that cover us today under the apparatus license, but that particular one has been removed. We honestly are very concerned that the removal of it opens the door for unlicensed or unauthorised people to come up on air without appropriate controls in place. So if it's operated by a person and they've got an amateur license, or an amateur is actively controlling a relay, that's one thing. But to have gateway systems sitting there that potentially through their interconnection could allow unlicensed people on the air, that's not an outcome we would support. So as I said, there are a couple of little things that we still think ACMA needs to address in the class license. We don't see them as being impossible, but there's still a little bit of work to do if they wish to get this implemented in our view. At this point, I think it rounds out the summary stuff we wanted to cover with class licensing. I'm very interested. Hayden, do we have any questions that people would like us to address perhaps on class licensing in particular?
Yeah, so pop your questions in the chat. There's been a couple of questions and a couple of comments that we'll bring up. Andy mentions the two sticking points to the lack of an official register. So we discussed it earlier, showing who a call sign is allocated to, and a lack of a physical document linking an individual with an allocated call sign. And on that note, VK2IG says that electronic services, so LOTWE, QSL, won't accept membership without a licensed document. So I'm not sure if you've got a comment on that at all.
So I've just put that up in front of everybody. This is actually in our submission, but it's worth just noting this is the New Zealand answer to that problem. They've actually got a certificate of proficiency where they also include the primary and secondary call signs that have been allocated. So that effectively links you to, I'm allowed to access the class license. Here is my call sign. Here is my qualifications. This is a solution that would work for us. The question is, how is ACMA going to retrofit this for all of the existing licensees? And that's something that is one of the questions we've actually asked in our submission. So that was was Andy questions? There was another part of Andy's question as well.
No, not in regards to Andy's question.
Okay.
Yeah, Bear made an interesting comment talking about reciprocal licenses keeping the privileges that they've had for decades.
Indeed, and that is a point we've also raised. We see that under the documentation issues where, again, how is ACMA intending to provide documentation to these guys, to people that have come in under the reciprocal licensing arrangements and hold an Australian apparatus license when they're taken out of apparatus licensing. Very, very keen to see ACMA's response on this point, and certainly it's something that we'll be raising with them. As far as we're concerned, that's a not negotiable. They need to fix that before they move us to a class license.
Andy did follow up with a comment. Sorry, he said, yes, that document is exactly what we need. So that's good feedback there.
That's good. And that's what we're pushing them for. A discussion we had with ACMA probably 8 weeks ago, they were aware of the NZ certificate, and I believe that's probably similar to what they'll head for, but we haven't actually seen something confirming that yet.
We've provided them, in fact, 2 sets of documents. One is for new licensees, which is the one that we've attached to our submission, or will attach, and the other one's for existing amateurs, and they've had that information for about 9 months. But so we keep on referring them back to it, and so it's something we're not going to let go.
Trevor says, will there be a requirement to have our radio certified, or can I still build my own transmitter?
Certainly there's been no intention from ACMA. We've asked them this question already, to remove any ability for us to have homebrew equipment or to make our own transmitters. There are some issues that we see still in the equipment rules aspects of the Radio Communications Act, and we think there are improvements that the ACMA can make there. At this stage, I think our view also is that that's a work in progress. There is certainly nothing going to take away our rights from what we do today. in what they have proposed. Class licensing doesn't automatically mandate you've got to have certified transmitters. And certainly they have included in the amateur draft class license the emission standards that were in our current apparatus draft license. And basically they've told us, look, it's as it was. And so their intention isn't to make any changes that would affect what we're currently doing in that space. But again, we would like to get some of the aspects of that clarified further, and it's a work in progress between the Institute and the ACMA.
An interesting comment again on call signs from Ashley. Simple way to fix call signs: assign a call sign once, sort of like a driver's license, Medicare number, no trading, one call sign issued for life upon passing an exam. Just don't tell Optus about your call sign, because you might find everyone will know about it.
So I guess, Ashley, an interesting point you've raised, and I'll give you some examples of why one call sign is probably not enough for some of us. And I'm probably a good example of where one call sign isn't enough. Some of you might know that I go off and do island expeditions. So for that particular purpose, I take out, when I'm down there, a separate call sign to basically publicise the fact that we're on an expedition, we're doing something unique. So I hold my home call VK5 Golf Radio for practically everything I do, but I hold VK5 KI specifically to go down to Kangaroo Island. There are other amateurs in Australia that want to go and access the VK9 territories for DXCC purposes and so on. These are things that the amateurs like to do. And so how do you hold your permanent call sign for life and then temporarily take out a call to go and operate as, say, VK9 CI on Cocos Island or VK9 LI on Lord Howe? So there is a case where you do sometimes want to hold two call signs. Another example might be you have a home station and you have a remote. And for DXCC reasons, perhaps you want to identify both of them separately. Some people have got their old call signs from their novice days and they want to keep that call sign as well as their full call. So you might have a 3-letter call and you might want to hold a 2-letter call as well for whatever reason. Certainly from New Zealand's example, they have this arrangement where they allow 2 call signs. You are assigned them on your certificate of proficiency up front. They also allow you to hold a couple of temporary call signs. So if you wanted to run a special event under the VI prefixes, they can. If you want to have a contest call sign for a couple of years and pay a renewal every year for the contest call sign, you can as well. And so we see those under the temporary calls. So yes, you could say, why don't you just assign one for life? That's it. Indeed, it is intended that you'll get one assigned for life on your certificate of proficiency. But there is a case for allowing a couple of more, at least, for those particular amateurs that want to take out those activities. It's not for everybody, but we have to make sure that we are being as inclusive as we can and support everybody's interest in amateur radio.
We have probably time for 2 more questions, but if we've got more time at the end, then we can get back to some more. So Harry says, they say there'll be a renewal process on call signs. How do they intend to set that procedure up?
Okay, so this is something we don't have a lot of information on. One of the things they do refer to in their consultation paper and in the draft class license paper is that they are establishing something they're going to call the call sign entity. The practical effect of that is it's going to be the people who currently run the amateur exams. So at this stage, it'll be AMC until their contract is up for renewal. And I'm assuming at that point, whoever wins the next contract will take over being the call sign entity. They're expecting that entity to manage the renewal arrangements, I assume. What those renewal arrangements will be, what they might look like commercially, we have no information on at this stage. And it's certainly something that I think we need to be asking questions about and seeking some feedback on. And it's certainly ensuring that it's only ever done on a cost recovery basis too. After all, that's what we currently operate on. The ACMA maintains that their cost to actually administer the amateur service is apparently only about $4 or $5 a year per person, and the rest of the money is spectrum access tax. So yes, I'm going to be very interested to see what they actually propose here as far as the practical arrangements. But that's their intention, is that they're going to have the AMC handle the renewals. They have asked questions around, is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Again, interested in people's feedback on that.
And really, the one of the reasons to have a renewal process is how the deceased amateurs are identified and their call signs become available into the pool. So, and people just drop out of the hobby for whatever reason, not interested anymore. So it's got to be a regular review of the existing database of call signs.
I guess some people would also turn around though, Peter, and say, well, there's plenty of call signs. I guess you need to understand though that the call sign rules are still bound, that if you apply for a call sign, you have to get a call sign from the state series that you're resident in. So a South Australian can't go and apply for a license, a call sign that's a VK6. So we still have that problem. We also have a problem where in VK2, 3, and I think 4, the 5-letter call signs are becoming quite scarce. And so if we didn't have a renewal process or a way of returning call signs to the pool, you would very quickly run out of 5-letter call signs and never be able to get them back. In fact, I've known it even here in VK5. There's a lot of people running around now with recycled call signs. Even in my 30 years as an amateur, there's a lot of call signs, and good friends of mine whom I knew in the 80s and 90s that have since subsequently passed on. Their call signs are coming back to life now, and I'm hearing them on the air again. You need to make sure that mechanism is possible.
Yeah, the 2-letter call signs are still highly demanded in New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland.
We might move on to John says, talking about any news on high power. So I believe that's the second part now for the presentation this evening.
Indeed it is. So, Peter, do you want to introduce this one?
Yes, the issue of high power is for many, well, for a number of amateurs wishing to avail themselves of using higher power for certain uses. The regulator is, let's say ACMA is a sensitive area for the regulator. And the general public are becoming a lot more aware of electromagnetic energy to the extent that the ACMA has undertaken a massive program of measuring EME radiation from all the 5G installations around Australia, a test of them, and probably 130 odd in each of the states, and they've got more to do. So they're taking the issue of EME quite seriously. So what we've said is essentially there are low risk uses by the amateur community, and that's the vast majority. But there's another group that are more experimental or desirous of intercommunication on a more reliable basis, particularly on HF, to access other parts of the world on an equal footing with other countries that do have high power privileges. We got a next slide there, I think. Yeah, so we point out that we are an experimental service, and of course the uses of particularly in the microwave spectrum, EME, Earth, Moon, Earth, or using other celestial bodies, meteor scatter and all that is an interesting area for research. So hence the potential need for increased power to make the study more useful.
I suppose one of the other things to also bring here, Peter, is some of the feedback we've had is like, why do amateurs want higher power at all? I guess it really depends on your perspective of what aspect of amateur radio that you wish to experiment with or wish to participate in. Certainly there's a lot of activities in amateur radio where you don't need higher power. And when we're talking about higher power too, let's just be clear, we're talking about power in excess of what we can operate with today. So we have high power arrangements already with our 400 watt SSB limits, and there are plenty of amateurs around Australia that are using 400 watts on HF today. But it's about making sure people understand that there are some amateurs out there that want access to it. We estimate probably 10 to 15% of the amateur population are genuinely interested in having access to higher power. Why do you need it? Depends on what you want to do. Now, if you're a contester, obviously there's some advantages, particularly in the international contests, in just getting over the noise floor at the far end of the circuit. If you want to play DX chasing and you're trying to talk into Africa and you try to compete against everybody in Europe calling a rare station, again, trying to do it at 400 watts versus 3 or 4 dB more or 5 dB more power, definitely an advantage to be able to at least reciprocate the level of power that the stations are using at the other end. There are others that simply say, but I have a hell of a lot of fun trying to do exactly the same contact at 10 watts. And that's completely fine. The fact that there are some people who want to pursue high power doesn't change the status that you don't always need it. But certainly there are people whom the hobby's enjoyment is enhanced by having access to it. And indeed, part of the other aspect for higher power is simply training on and experimentation and learning about how to actually operate with higher power. This all goes to the fundamental arrangements of the amateur service, where we're all about self-training. Not just being able to communicate, but also train and learn and experiment. But most importantly, also, it is the intercommunication aspect. And this is actually a point to highlight, because this is something we think ACMA has missed here in what they have put forward in their high-powered proposed frameworks. Let's have a look at what ACMA has proposed and how they think that they would like to try and implement it. They really have gone down the pathway of a staged introduction of the privilege. Now, the staging element itself, the WIA absolutely supports. We can't understate the importance of managing our RF safety. Certainly, the community is concerned. We've seen that the cellular industries, for instance, often get wrapped up in those concerns. We need to make sure that the amateur service doesn't get landed with the same hysteria. So the staging of the privileges, building it up in steps that can grow comfort with the ACMA, that the amateur service knows what it's doing and can manage this stuff safely, we think is important. However, the ACMA then has gone down a route of some very strict regulatory oversight of all of the activities. And we think that's probably a direction that's not ultimately in the amateur service's interest. Their reaction has obviously been driven by their concern that, in fact, it's interesting. I'll make this point. Here in Australia, the ACMA is the body responsible for regulating EME or RF safety. Most of the countries in the world, it's actually the health departments. So hence the ACMA, unfortunately for us, probably has more burdens on their shoulders and hence are somewhat more sensitive to ensuring that this is being followed. In their staging, they're approaching it from a perspective of trying to be very restrictive around which activities can even use higher power. I mean, they're prepared to continue the existing arrangements for moon bounce and communication via a celestial body as the current arrangements stand. You can still, as I understand it, you'll still be able to access those. But for anything else, they're trying to go down this pathway of introducing it through a scientific licensing framework, as opposed to amateur licensing. Now, they can issue scientific licenses in the amateur bands, and they're saying we can use our amateur call signs under a scientific license and participate in experiments on the amateur bands. But one of the fundamental problems is that we see with scientific licensing is it doesn't support intercommunication in its definition. If you actually go and have a look at what the scientific license has in it, there's a whole series of things that it's allowed to be used for. Intercommunication is not there. And so fundamentally, we're not actually convinced that scientific licensing is fit for purpose. the other point we will make is that the fees that they talk about for us applying for a scientific license to go and do a high power experiment in propagation study is about all they're prepared to consider at this point, say on HF, it's $600. And then there's another yearly fee on top of that. And they also are looking for external EME assessments. And in our research, you could pay somewhere around $5,000 for one of those. And that's for a very fixed, locked up, this is the station that you are using. You are not allowed to change it, because if you change it, you're changing away the conditions that it's certified under. This is so not amateur-like. It's an arrangement that we just cannot see working. We need to find a middle ground with the ACMA here to find a way to make this actually work. The big concerns that we know ACMA want us to address, first of all, they've listed interference to other services as one of their concerns. It's interesting, when we talk to them about this, they downplay it to an extent, but they, nonetheless, they still have listed it in their consultation. They also talk about location. They're concerned where amateurs will try to use higher powered transmitters. They're particularly concerned about people doing it in dense residential areas. And clearly, if you're doing your EME safety assessments and your station management properly, you probably find that in those areas, you could never use it anyway. I guess the ACMA is not convinced we're going to do that properly, which is why they're being so very forceful in how they want us to actually explain what we're doing. They have made the statement of the likelihood of amateur radio operators successfully complying with EME safety requirements and record keeping. Clearly, they don't think we can. At least that seems to be the viewpoint that their submission has put forward. Unfortunately, we are aware of circumstances that occurred in the last trial where some people weren't very well informed about this. And unfortunately, ACMA is well aware of that. And so I think we've got some bridges to build here. We as the amateur service, we will need to show that we can actually follow the rules. And the rules aren't as draconian as you might think. But there's a learning curve here for everybody in how to deal with this properly. What we really want to see from the WIA's perspective is a workable outcome, and we want it inside the amateur license framework, and assuming that'll be the class license framework from sometime next year. We do, however, think that the amateurs are going to have to demonstrate an ability to properly comply with the EME safety standards. Our UK friends at the moment are going through this exact same thing. And it's actually really heartening to see the work that RSGB has done in this space, because there is a way to go and actually certify your station and consider the process of doing the calculations, doing the assessment, making the adjustments to your station so that you do comply, and understanding what you're doing. And it's not onerous. You've just got to go and do it. And then keep the records, the fact that you did it. So that if anybody comes along later and says, did you ever do it? Do you know that you were compliant? You can turn around and say, yeah, here it is. Here's my documents.
Can I just say one word there? The ACMA may, in fact, if an arrangement does come into place, they will do audits. And these will be desk audits, and you'll receive a letter, and that will basically be for all amateurs, whether they're high power, low power. They want to see a copy of your how did you assess and a copy of your documentations. Please give them to us in 14 days.
I tell you what amateurs probably don't realise is they can actually do that today.
Yeah, that's what I said. These arrangements have always been there. And I personally do my assessment. I've done it and keep a record.
So the other areas, of course, that they're also interested in ensuring we can comply with is that we can manage our electromagnetic interference complaints. They're concerned higher power is going to make more TVI complaints, more work for them. We need to make sure, and I personally believe most amateurs already take care of EMI complaints themselves. I know in my environment, with my station, I've had problems with my neighbour's TV set. I took care of it. I organised a high-pass filter for him. He has no more problems with his TV set. He's happy. Didn't need to involve ACMA. And as long as amateurs understand, that's a responsibility you have to make sure that you can successfully coexist in your environment with your neighbours.
And the New Zealand experience indicates that the cases are so low and they're already running high power anyway.
Indeed. We have asked in the survey for people to give us feedback on this point. We're very interested to find examples in Australia that we can also use. I mean, one of the points to note with the ACMA is they're an evidence-based authority. And we need to be able to get the evidence together to be able to demonstrate to them what's going on. The other aspect of what their concerns are is that they need us to manage our impacts on other spectrum users. Now, I have a little bit of an issue with this one because when you try to run the numbers for how might a higher power signal on, say, on HF from an amateur, how might that affect a commercial operator? You really struggle to actually manage to make an impact on a commercial operator's receiver on an adjacent channel basis. Within the amateur service, well, that's no different to what we do today. I mean, it's basically if you're suffering interference, you QSY. It's part of being an unassigned service. And that's just in the amateur service DNA. But they're concerned about the other spectrum users. VHF and UHF, the potential is there. On the 2 meter band, if you're running really high power on 144 and you were close to a civil aviation base station, maybe you'd cause it some problems. Those sorts of things just require a little bit of understanding and knowledge to be able to manage. We just need to make sure the amateurs know how to do that. Ultimately, we need to find a way to take care of ACMA's concerns in a way that works for us while addresses what ACMA is worried about. We've listed in our paper 3 proposals, very open to having others suggested to us in the survey. The one that we obviously know up front is the ACMA's preferred option that they've put forward in the consultation paper, which is a very heavily regulated way with very direct ACMA oversight of what you're doing. Not an area, not a direction that we think is great for amateur radio. Probably what everyone would like to be able to have is an arrangement where we can also all take on our own self-training on EME safety. We learn how to get our mandated documentation in place and improve the way that we manage our EME compliance. And then be subject to audit on that. The question mark on that is simply going to be, is ACMA going to be satisfied with that? Certainly it's the position we need to take forward initially. I think we're going to have to see if that is something that they can ultimately be willing to consider. As I said, we have a lot of history, unfortunately, that has happened in the past that we will need to overcome to gain their trust. The amateur service can do this properly. Ultimately, we may have to consider, and this is another idea that is up, and we're interested in members' feedback on it, but we may have to consider additional proficiency certifications for amateurs. If you want to run more than 400 watts, maybe you do need to go and actually sit an additional exam. Go and do some more study to understand how to look after your RF environment properly to maintain everything within the UPANZA safety limits. On most amateur spectrum and most amateur activities, that is actually easy to do. The only activities you've really got to be careful of is when you're on VHF and UHF and you want to do 6 meter moon bounce, for example, or 2 meter moon bounce, or 2 meter high power DXing. Those modes, understand you can end up with hazard zones in front of your antennas that can be somewhere between 30 and 60 meters downstream. I know with my own 6 meter moon bounce experiments, I've had to be quite careful with that. And I had a lot of convincing to do to get my high power permit from ACMA over this as well. It's certainly something they're touchy about. So we need to be able to figure out, can we come up with a self-certification regime that all amateurs can access that ACMA is satisfied with, or do we need to go and actually do an additional proficiency certification to show them that we know before they're prepared to let us do it? Would love our members' feedback on this one. We're really not sure what the right direction is to go, but these are 3 things we can see that are on the horizon as ways forward. Very keen to hear some feedback. We do support their staged introduction. we do recognise that not all locations are going to be suitable for higher power use as well. And we think that the self-managed framework assessments is something that can be made to work. And certainly what we've seen from RSGB in particular is quite impressive. These are the things that we would have to add to the pot, we believe, to get ACMA to actually reconsider allowing higher power access off of standard amateur licenses. Or in this case, will be off the future class license. So, these are some of the considerations that we've had. As I said, ultimately, your feedback is essential. We find a very difficult area to know what the will of the amateur service is and what our members want. Very keen to hear feedback on it. Best thing you can do is to fill out the survey and give us your ideas. I think if we don't, however, convince the ACMA that we can manage our EME safety properly, we will ultimately fail. It is something we know they are very, very concerned about. Is the level of concern commensurate with the real risk? I think we need to be the judge of that, and we need to work through those cases. But we, regardless of what the real risk is, the ACMA perceives a problem there, and they are going to require us to address it some way or other. So I think at that point, it's that's all the main data we wanted to present. I guess Hayden, questions.
Yeah, we've got 4 minutes, and we've got still 2 questions that we had queued up from before. One from VK3WL, high power. Why is it not an issue in other countries, but it is in VK? Is the RF in VK of higher potency than in other countries? And that's a very good point. I know in the submission the WIA put forward, the response rather, there was a chart that you had which had the various power levels of all the different countries listed.
Certainly, we think that the amateur service is being handed a bit of a raw deal as far as reciprocity goes. Why is it not an issue in any other country? I think the fundamental reason is twofold. One, the communications regulators in almost every other country in the world are not responsible for EME safety. Unfortunately for us, the ACMA is, and so they have a heightened awareness of it. Is the RF any more potent? In fact, no, absolutely, it's not. In fact, more interestingly, the ARPANSA standards were recently revised to reflect the international standards. And indeed, so the standards we have to follow here are the same as anywhere else. So, is it more risky? No, I don't believe it is. We just need to find a way to convince ACMA that the way we are approaching and managing the risk is appropriate and acceptable.
Mm-hmm. And such an arrangement, the ACMA can go to government and say, we're satisfied that this is not a risk to public health.
One final question I think we'll land on is, will the WIA and AMC support keeping state numbers in call signs?
Absolutely. And indeed, the ACMA policy statement has made that quite clear. They're intending that the call signs policy arrangements will continue as they are today as far as what call sign sequences go where. So there's been no moves to change that. Basically, for those who aren't unaware, the current arrangement is you can apply for a call sign in the state you reside in. You will be given the series from the state that you're living in. You can keep that call sign now and go and operate it from another state. So, if I move from Adelaide to Sydney, I can keep my VK5 call sign and continue operating in Sydney. That's fine. So that degree of mobility is permitted. I won't be forced to go and get a VK2 call if I move. But I can't, sitting in South Australia, apply for a VK2 call. The only exceptions to that are the VK9s. So if you wanted to go on an expedition to one of the external territories, different story.
Or Antarctica as well.
If you're crazy enough and like the cold.
Yeah. Well, we've got about another minute left. I guess it's any final words from Scott or anyone else, Lee?
Yeah, look, I'll probably just chime in there if I can, Hayden. Look, there's a couple of important dates and things we need to be wary of. Firstly, that the deadline for the submission is the 29th of November. So that is the time that we have to actually make our submission to the ACMA. In regard to the deadline for our survey, that is approaching this Tuesday night, the 22nd of November. So I think we've had, Grant, in excess of 300 survey responses. So I think we're pretty happy with that. But obviously, we'd like to see some more. And in regard to, you know, Hayden's got going across the screen at the moment, anybody who still has any non-member that is not registered, you really need to do so by tomorrow night, because we're going to need to get that survey out to you probably Monday morning, and you're probably going to have to do it pretty quickly. You're really only going to have Monday and Tuesday before that deadline is looming. Now, we're also aware that there is about, Grant, 20 people that registered the other day, non-members, and we will consolidate those 20 odd people. Yeah, with are you going to?
I actually did reissue them tonight. So there might have been a couple that went out with links that didn't work. I believe I have fixed that. If there are any non-members that are having problems with their links, please email the WIA. We will get it fixed and get it to the survey to you as soon as we can.
Yeah, and we've had a couple, haven't we, Grant? We've had the odd one or two which there's
two or three that have had problems with it. So
yeah. But look,
I did notice. Yeah,
Sorry.
I was just going to say I did notice a couple of comments saying about links. So the email to contact is register@wia.org.au. Is that correct?
Yes. Correct. Yep. Register@wia.org.au. So just those times again for non-members, please do so by tomorrow night. And obviously for the survey, the poll, that will cut off on Tuesday night, because obviously we need some time for the Spectrum Strategy Group to obviously work through all the responses, reconcile everything, amend accordingly our current submission, and then obviously push the button. But look, I just want to say, if I can, a big thank you, particularly Grant, to you, and to you, Peter Young. Thank you for your tireless work. Thank you to all the Spectrum Strategy Group. I won't read out all the names again, but there's many of them obviously watching. A big thanks to you, Hayden, obviously for hosting this through Ham Radio DX. It really does make life easy for us. So anything for anybody else in closing around the group before we go? Anything else? No, I think we're all good. Look, good evening, everybody, and thanks for tuning in this evening to this WIA policy development session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.